You're listening to continuing coverage in the suitcase murder, the trial of Sarah Boone, from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Now, back to the courtroom.
Good morning, everyone. Madam Clerk's going to go ahead and call the case to order.
Case number 2020 CF 2603, State of Florida, Sarah Boone. Charges and names for the record, beginning with the state.
David Castro on behalf of the state.
William J. for the state.
Defense.
James Owens for Ms. Boone.
Tony Henderson for Sarah Boone.
Kevin Beck on behalf of Sarah Boone.
Ms. Boone, raise your right hand to be sworn. Please, do you swear or affirm that the testimony that you give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning. Can you state your full name and date of birth for the record for me?
Sarah Boone, 10-10-77.
Ms. Boone is seated at counsel's table wearing a dark gray suit jacket and a maroon blouse. She is in custody. However, she's not in any restraints, so we will be continuing to stand as our jury enters and exits. State, are there any housekeeping matters we need to address this morning before we bring in our panel? Defense.
Judge, I don't know if you got the email last night of the potential witnesses we're going to call.
In addition to the one I received this morning, yes, sir.
Okay, Dr. Harper didn't get in last night after midnight. She was over at the hotel, but in addition, we may recall the phone extraction expert. She's not on the list.
Okay, understood. All right. Are we ready to bring in our panel?
Yes.
Okay. All right, very good. Let's go ahead and stand and bring in our panel.
All right, jury's entering.
State, do you recognize our jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense, do you recognize our jury?
Yes.
All right, everyone can be seated. Members of the jury, good morning. Welcome back to 12 Alpha of the Orange County Courthouse. I hope you had a great evening. If you could, again, just by a show of hands, you complied with the court's instructions for the overnight break. Record reflect all hands have been raised. Members of the jury, at this point in time, the defense is going to continue with their evidence and testimony presentation. And I'm going to ask them to call their first witness at this time. Mr. Owens, you may proceed, sir.
At this time, the defense calls Deputy Ramirez Delgado.
give, shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I swear.
Good morning. You can be seated, and can you please state and spell your name for the record for me?
Yes, sir. My name is Jessica, first name Jessica, Jessica. First last name is Ramirez, Ramirez. Second last name is Delgado, Delgado.
Thank you, ma'am. You may inquire, sir.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning, sir.
Ma'am, how are you employed?
I am a reserve deputy with the Orange County Sheriff's Office,
And how long have you been employed with the sheriff's department?
7 years.
Back on July the 25th of 2018, how were you employed at that time?
I was a full-time deputy sheriff for the agency.
On that date, ma'am, did you have the occasion, due to your duties, to report or to go to 4748 Franks Lane, apartment number 3?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall what you were going there for, the purpose?
Yes, sir. I was a backup deputy for a call involving a male kicking a female in the face, so it came out as a domestic call.
Okay. And was it another officer who also responded?
Yes, sir. He was the primary.
Okay. Ma'am, while you were there, did you have contact with Sarah Boone?
Yes, sir.
While having contact with Miss Boone, were you able to observe any injuries?
Yes, sir.
to her person?
Yes, sir. She had swelling and bruising in her right eye.
And ma'am, were you able to make contact with Mr. Jorge Torres?
Yes, sir.
Were you able to notice any injuries on his person?
Yes, sir. He had red markings and some abrasions around his neck.
Ma'am, at a certain point in time, did you place Miss Boone under arrest?
Yes, sir. I detained her and placed her in my vehicle.
Ma'am, at that time, do you recall or remember Miss Boone asking you, "Why am I in trouble?"
Yes, sir.
And without saying what you said, but did you respond to her?
Yes, sir.
After that, ma'am, do you remember Miss Boone asking you, "Why?" "Because I fucking fought back."
Yes, sir.
If I can have one more.
Yes, sir.
No further questions.
Thank you. Any cross-examination?
During the course of your investigation, you or the other responding deputies spoke to Mr. Torres as well.
Yes, sir.
After concluding all of your investigation, which involved talking to both Mr. Torres and to Ms. Boone and making your observations of the two of them, did you all make final decisions about how to handle your investigation?
The other deputy, which at the time was Deputy Zito, was the one that made that determination.
Okay. But collectively, what you all looked at was statements from Ms. Boone and Mr. Torres, correct?
Yes, sir.
And your physical observations of both persons?
Yes.
And then whatever else you may have observed on scene?
Yes, sir.
And do you take into account people's demeanor when they are giving you statements, when assessing their credibility?
Yes, sir.
No other questions?
Any redirect examination?
No, Your Honor.
Can this witness be released?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Defense, call your next witness.
At this time, the defense calls Deputy John Alden.
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you should give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Sir, good morning. Can you state and spell your name for the record?
John Alden, John Alden.
All right, thank you, sir. You may be seated. Mr. Henderson, you may inquire.
Morning, sir.
Morning.
Sir, how are you employed? How are you employed?
I'm employed with the Orange County Sheriff's Office as a corporal.
Back on August the 28th of 2019, how were you employed?
I was a deputy in the Uniform Patrol Division in Sector 2.
As a part of your job duties that day, did you have the occasion to respond to 4748 France Lane, number 3?
Yes.
What was the purpose?
There ended up being a battery call.
And, sir, were you the lead officer on this case?
Yes.
Were there any other backup officers there with you?
I believe so.
Sir, on that date, August the 28th of 2019, did you come in contact with Sarah Boone?
Yes.
Sir, on that date, did you observe any injuries on Sarah Boone?
I observed redness on the left side of her neck and what to be an old injury to her right eye.
Sir, on August 28th of 2019, did you come in contact with Jorge Torres?
Yes.
And did you notice any injuries on Mr. Torres?
Yes, he had some redness on it by his left eye.
Sir, on that day, was Mr. Torres placed under arrest?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any cross-examination?
Yes. Is it fair to say that Mr. Torres had quite a few marks on him?
From my report, I remember marking the redness by his left eye.
And did you have your body-worn camera activated when you responded to this call?
I believe so.
And so that would be the best evidence of both video and audio as to what occurred while you were on scene.
It would, especially since this happened 4 years or 5 years ago now.
And did Mr. Torres refuse to say what happened that day?
He did.
Based on the conclusion of your investigation, which involved talking to Ms. Boone and attempting to talk to Mr. Torres, as well as your visual observations of both them and the scene, is that how you all reach your conclusions?
Yes.
No other questions?
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Can this witness be released?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. J?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Defense, you can call your next witness.
Judge, may we approach him?
Yes. Defense, you can call your next witness.
Judge, at this time, the defense calls Deputy Cosper. Or Detective, excuse me.
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you share shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good morning again. Could you state your full name and date of birth for the record? Or, I'm sorry, full name and spell it for us.
It's Chelsea Kepsel, Chelsey. Last name is Koepsell.
Thank you. Counselor, you may inquire.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
In relation to this case, on February the 26th of 2020, did you have the occasion to interview Abraham Marino?
Yes, I did.
Was that interview recorded, ma'am?
Yes, it was.
You remember as part of that interview that Mr. Marino tell you that he had had contact with Sarah Boone on February the 24th of 2020?
Are you asking the night of the incident when police were called out?
Yes, the next morning.
The day that we were called?
That you were called out,
Okay.
the 24th.
So, yes, he did have contact with her, but it wasn't in the morning. It was while we were there.
While you were there?
Yes.
Okay. What time did you get there? That's probably what's wrong.
I got there around 14:20 hours, which would be 2:20 in the afternoon.
Okay. So the afternoon on the 24th?
No, it was later. I recall, I believe I was doing paperwork in my vehicle, so it would have been at some point during the investigation, but it wasn't, I didn't notice him until, I'm not sure if I noticed him until before or after Sarah was interviewed.
All right, but to his interview part, the interview, did he tell you in the interview that he had had contact with Miss Boone on that day?
Yes, he did.
Did he tell you at that time that Miss Boone had made a statement to him?
Yes, he did.
Do you remember what that statement was?
I don't wish to quote what he stated. So I don't know the exact verbiage, but he basically replayed what, I'm not sure if he replayed what exactly occurred that day, but I do know he mentioned something about, she mentioned being dragged down the stairs a couple days prior.
Did he say to you during that interview that Sarah Boone told us that a couple of days ago they had gotten into a fight where he grabbed her by her hair and dragged her down the steps?
I would assume that he's reading my report, and that does sound similar to what my report should say.
So this statement was given on the 27th of February. I'm sorry, the 26th of February. Would you
Yes.
agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Okay. The contact and the statement that Ms. Boone made to Mr. Moreno was on the 24th of February. Is that correct?
Repeat the question, I'm sorry.
When Mr. Moreno is saying that Ms. Boone came up to him and made this statement that we just talked about,
Yes,
that was on February the 24th. Is that correct?
that is correct.
So when she said a couple of days ago, that would have brought it back to February the 22nd. Is that correct?
Potentially, yes.
Ma'am, during that interview with you, did Mr. Marino ever indicate to you that when he had contact with Ms. Boone on the 24th, that Sarah Boone told him what happened was an accident? Did he say that Sarah Boone stated that she was teaching him a lesson and things got out of hand and that she fell asleep?
I don't recall the entirety of that being accurate. Yeah, I don't recall the entirety of what he just said being accurate.
Do you remember him saying that at all?
He did say that she had, I believe he said on the recording, passed out. So that's why, like, part of the statements might be accurate, but
Okay. Ma'am, would it refresh your memory if you were to see the recorded statement?
his recorded statement, the
Yes.
transcription?
Yes.
Sure, yeah, great.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
Now take your time. Read through that.
Okay,
When you ready, just let me know.
okay. I don't recall all the statements that you asked, or the way you asked it, but
Would it help if I repeat it?
sure, yeah.
Okay.
You asked, like, you said multiple statements, so
Yes, ma'am.
this was a, like, 11-minute interview.
All right. The statement would be that Sarah Boone stated to Mr. Marino that she was teaching him a lesson and things got out of hand and that she fell asleep. And I'm wanting to know if...
Did you say, okay, I thought I heard you say passed out the first time. I'm not sure if you said passed out or fell asleep.
Fell asleep.
Fell asleep, okay.
And what I'm asking is there any indication that he told you that statement on the date of that interview on the 26th?
Sorry, I'm trying to go to the part where we talked about that.
Yes, ma'am, take your time.
Okay. Okay, so like I had stated, there were certain things that I thought was accurate from your statement. He stated, do I just read exactly what it says? Do you need like the number next to it or anything?
Yes, I have no problem if you reading what he said.
Okay, then she,
I would object.
Approach. Ma'am, you cannot read the statement at this time.
okay.
Thank you. You may continue, Mr. Henderson.
Yes.
He described,
Hang on.
No.
Just wait for a question,
so
okay?
sorry.
It's okay.
Yes, sorry.
Ma'am, anywhere in that interview, do you see reference to this statement that Sarah stated that she was teaching him a lesson and things got out of hand and that she fell asleep?
No to the first two parts of your question. I heard passed out the first time you asked me this question, and that's why I said that part of it was accurate, because he did say that she passed out in his statement. That was what Sarah told him.
Okay, did she say she was teaching him a lesson? Is that in there?
No,
And things got out of hand. Is that in there?
no, I don't recall that.
May I approach the witness?
Yes.
And again, ma'am, this interview was on February the 26th of 2020. Is that correct?
Yes, it was.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any cross-examination?
No other questions, John?
All right, thank you. Can this witness be released?
Yes, Your Honor.
State?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Defense, call the next witness.
I believe Dr. Brandon is here, Madam Judge.
All right.
Making sure. Judge, may we approach?
Yes, sir. All right, members of the jury, we're just waiting on a witness. They are using the facilities outside, so as soon as they're done, we'll bring in our next witness. Thank you for your patience.
When did we call?
Your Honor, at this time, the defense would call Dr. Michael Brandon.
All right, very good.
Please swear or affirm that the testimony you should give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Doctor, good morning.
morning,
Could you
Your Honor.
state and spell your name for the record for us?
Michael Brannon, Brannon.
All right, thank you. Counselor, you may inquire.
Thank you. Dr. Brandon, good morning.
Good morning.
Spry, having just traveled from Miami to Orlando.
Yes,
Is that not correct? Okay.
it was a good drive.
Would you please describe for the jury your background, training, and experience, both in forensic psychology as well as battered women syndrome?
Sure. So I'm a psychologist licensed in the state of Florida. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. That's from a university called Nova University. I also have a master's degree in psychology. I received that in 1980, also in psychology. And I received my doctoral degree in psychology after a year internship where I worked with severely mentally ill individuals in Hialeah, Florida. In 1988, I finished my degree requirements for my doctorate in psychology. And in 1990, I was licensed as a psychologist. I've been operating as a psychologist since then, since 1990. Originally, I started off doing the work that most people kind of think about when they think about psychologists, doing therapy, counseling with people, helping them through with their problems, things like that. In 1994, I began on a career almost quite accidentally as a forensic psychologist when I testified in my first case in front of a jury. And from that time on, I've been doing mostly forensic psychology. My practice very quickly changed from that time on. I'm currently the co-director of the Institute for Behavioral Sciences and the Law, and anywhere between 80 and 90% of all my work now is related to some legal or court-related matter in the ways in which mental health interfaces or impacts or helps to give opinions about various legal issues. I've taught rather extensively in the area of forensic psychology. I teach to mostly legal audiences, but oftentimes too I speak to groups of psychology students wanting to sit up here and do what I'm doing as well. Make long drives and then come up here and talk to people about cases. I also currently on the staff, the adjunct faculty staff for the School of Psychiatry at Florida Atlantic University. I help to train their forensic psychiatrists, so not just psychologists, but psychiatrists in terms of doing this work as a psychologist or as a psychiatrist, a mental health professional who gives opinions in the courtroom.
And are you also required to update your educational background and knowledge as a forensic psychologist?
Yes, sir. So every 2 years we're required to get 40 continuing education credits to maintain our license. And part of that is we have to, on a regular basis, update our work in domestic violence or battered women syndrome. So we have to take those courses. We're all required, whether you're a forensic psychologist or not, to take that coursework. So as part of our requirements, we also have to take separate coursework in regards to domestic violence as a general term, or intimate partner violence. But along with that comes discussion as well with battered spouse, or what's oftentimes called battered person syndrome now.
And I apologize, I'm kind of bouncing around here, Doctor. I apologize again. For the uninitiated, just exactly what do you mean by forensic psychology?
So forensic psychology is a division of psychology. Most people don't think about that as often when they think about psychologists. But forensic psychologists are individuals who have degrees in psychology who are working to help to answer questions that come up in the legal system. It could be in criminal cases like we're here for today, answering various criminal questions, giving opinions about those questions. Or it could be in other settings like family settings, divorce proceedings, or sometimes civil settings like personal injury. Someone's claiming some emotional damage or something has happened to them. So forensic psychology is really the way that we use the science of psychology to help give opinions about various legal matters.
Now, what is the DSM or the DSM-5?
So the DSM it stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's kind of our code book, if you will, to help us to know what the different symptoms are for different mental health disorders, whether it's major depression or schizophrenia or anxiety. So it gives us a code book of here's the criteria you have to meet in order to have that diagnosis. And then we're able to utilize that in terms of either treatment, so even insurance billing, but being able to inform patients too about what condition we think that they're suffering from. It's been updated many times over the years. It started at just DSM, and now it's at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, text revised. So we've gone through a lot of revisions over the years to kind of fine-tune in an empirical or scientific way what the elements are, if you will, of various mental health conditions.
Now, you've been asked to testify today in regards to battered women syndrome. Is the battered women syndrome identified or located within the DSM-5?
So it is not. It is not a diagnostic category in the DSM-5 or other coding books as well. There's others besides the DSM. That's just the most popular one. But it's not a formal diagnosis that it is contained within that book, that classification manual that I just told you about.
Within your field of forensic psychology, however, is there a subcategory that is located within the DSM-5 that experts would recognize as a DSM diagnosis?
Yes, sir.
And what is that, sir?
So that category would be in the trauma section of the DSM-5 TR. There's a whole category on trauma disorders, and it's most closely related to something that we call post-traumatic stress disorder. That isn't the only trauma disorder, but that's the one that what used to be called battered women syndrome, now I refer to it as battered person syndrome, but all of it really is more connected to a trauma disorder like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Now, testify that you testify on criminal matters. Do you also testify? You indicated also on personal injury cases and emotional. That would be civil, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In your experience, you've testified as an expert, as a forensic psychologist. Have you testified for, and today you're testifying for the defense or were called by the defense. Do you also testify for the state of Florida or other states within this country?
Yes to both of those. I've testified in other states. I also testify for both the prosecution, the state or government, depending if it's federal or if it's a state case, and also for the defense. So I really get appointments and hired by both sides.
About how many times have you testified?
Wow. At last count, it was about 1,500 times. It's over that, way over that now. That was from a few years ago. But I testify in a lot of different kinds of hearings and trials over the course of, mostly in Florida, but in other states as well.
Now, you're familiar with the fact that there is a special jury instruction that's been recognized by the Florida Supreme Court.
Approach. The objection is sustained.
I apologize. Doctor, you testified as to battered women syndrome, battered person syndrome. Are there other synonyms or similar names for what you're describing, in particular battered spouse syndrome?
Well, we talk about it in terms of trauma disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, but the way when it's applied to the legal system, it's called battered wife, or that was the original terminology for it, battered wife syndrome or battered person syndrome. So it really depends on your setting. So in this setting, we oftentimes talk about this particular condition that I've been asked to talk about today, is really referred to as battered spouse syndrome.
And have you been asked to give your opinion as a legal expert and on battered spouse syndrome?
Yes, sir.
How frequently have you been asked to do that?
I've been involved in about 100 cases of just that alone. I've been involved in some sort of testimony about 50 times.
And you indicated that you testified for the state, you testified for the defense, you testified in state cases, federal cases. Could you break down on a percentage basis the number of times you testified for the state versus testifying for the defense?
It's really close in terms of the last time we looked at it, it was about 50-50. On most cases, like for instance, if there's a case that involves battered spouse, potentially battered spouse or battered wife syndrome, I'm usually called by the defense first because they raise the issue. If you're called by the prosecution, whether it be federal or state, what oftentimes happens is it's in response to a defense expert that's been called. So do I agree or disagree with that other expert? So I'm usually, the call usually comes first from the defense, but in terms of who I'm hired by, it's pretty even. It's about 50-50.
Now, this time, Your Honor, I will proffer the witness as an expert in the field of forensic psychology.
Maybe approach.
Yes, approach. Objection is sustained. Wait. Objection is still sustained. Mr. Beck, you may continue.
Has battered spouse syndrome been accepted, to your knowledge, in the Florida court system?
Yes, sir.
Objection, legal conclusion?
Sustained.
Can you describe the classic system or systemology wherein an individual might necessarily suffer and then exhibit symptoms of battered women syndrome?
Yes. So battered spouse syndrome is a woman, usually a woman's response. Doesn't have to be, but that's a classic historical research went into how women respond in situations in which there's intimate partner violence, when they've been the victim of violence. Now we know, of course, in other kinds of relationships, men can be a victim of it as well, or whether it's a heterosexual or homosexual relationship, that both men and women can be victims. But we still know the majority of those individuals that are diagnosed with that condition or given that condition, classified with that condition, are women.
Bless you.
We do know that it's a reaction, a strategy that's developed by the person who's being abused to someone who's abusing them in an intimate partner situation. And essentially what they're doing is they've made a determination that they can't effectively escape from the abuse. They can't just leave for some reason. They feel in danger or they've been threatened if they leave that something bad will happen to them. So it's a cognitive or thinking strategy on the part of the person being abused that I have to develop some coping skills or ways of protecting myself or maybe even loved ones as well from some form of imminent violence or danger or lethality. Something bad will happen to me if I don't develop a way of handling this abuse, this constant abuse that's coming towards me. So the battered wife syndrome is really a way of thinking. It's a psychological change that happens with a victim in terms of the way they cope and strategize to stay safe for themselves and other loved ones as well, oftentimes.
I'm going to ask a really silly question, if I may, Doctor. I don't know if you've noticed a bruise across the bridge of my nose this morning.
I did see that when I came in. Yes, sir.
Okay. This weekend, hypothetically, if an individual was digging around in the garbage, the lid fell down and cut his nose, the bridge of his nose wide open, would you as a forensic psychologist anticipate, or a psychologist in general, anticipate that there might be a physical or a psychological reaction or response to that degree of trauma?
So I don't know if it would be trauma or not. It could be, depending on the degree of the injury and the pain and things like that. But certainly you'd view that garbage can differently as you approached it. So it changes your psychology or the way that you look at that particular situation or that particular object. So by viewing it differently, you may engage in different behaviors. You may approach it differently. You may have somebody else approach it. You may approach it with both hands up. So it changes your behavior and your thinking about that garbage can.
Does that also apply to interpersonal relationships?
So it certainly can. No two people always react the same way to every situation. Trauma, one person's trauma is not a trauma to another person. But for people who do develop battered spouse syndrome, they do begin to change the way they view the person who's abusing them and what they have to do in order to maintain either their life or their safety, their physical safety in terms of their behavior and interactions with that person.
Now, is there a specific set of criteria that a psychologist, forensic psychologist, would necessarily rely upon in attempting to make a diagnosis or an assessment of battered women syndrome?
Yes, sir.
And what are those criteria?
Well, you'd want to see one if some type of abuse has occurred. That abuse can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be emotional, or it can just be the threat of abuse or bad things that's going to happen to you. So there has to be something bad that's happened or that's threatened to be happening over a period of time. So abuse has to be present in order for this to be underway. Without abuse, there's no battered wife syndrome. But that's not enough. There also has to be what's called coercive control. Coercive control is really keeping the person's social interactions, overseen on a regular basis, controlling money, controlling preferences, even TV preferences, sometimes social media, looking at social media that the person is accessing or looking at, who they're talking to on Facebook, who they're texting. So it's a combination of abuse and coercive control that results in a person feeling victimized, but that's still not enough. That person then has to feel like they can't escape from that. They've either been told, if you leave me, you're going to die, or a family member is going to be harmed, your children, your mother, whatever it might be. And as a result of that, they develop strategies to cope with that, acquiescing, pleasing, doing anything they're asked to do, demeaning themselves, allowing themselves to be controlled. All of the things that would fend off, if you will, some abuse or attack or threat to them or someone who surrounds them. So those would be the components that you would need to have, and that dance continues to go on usually repeatedly throughout the course of that relationship.
So I think what you're describing is, in a sense, a subjective nature to the syndrome that's being described.
It's both objective and subjective. So objective in terms of the facts, like what's really happening. A person's being abused, they're being told certain things, there's control over them. But then a subjective part is the person's interpretation of that, their perception of that. So there's really both going on, and they have to kind of work together in order for this syndrome to be formalized and properly diagnosed.
You indicated that there sometimes may be some defense mechanisms that are, or strategies that are devised by the battered individual, the abused individual.
Yes, sir.
In your experience and your training, do controlled substances, alcohol, drugs, frequently appear in your analysis or assessment?
Yes, and the way they appear is they can appear either from the abuser or the abused or both. What can happen from the abuser standpoint is they may only be abusive, or the abuse may become worse if they abuse substances. From the abused standpoint, it may be self-medication. It may be a way of coping with the anxiety that there's going to be something bad that potentially could happen to them or somebody else. It's kind of a way of dealing with walking on the eggshells. So if I use substances, that can deaden the pain, if you will, for me, or help me to forget about it. So it's oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes part of either the abuser's behavior or the abused behavior.
Do they, in your experience, do they, on occasion, actually defend the individual that is abusing them?
That's a very frequent part of this syndrome. Not always, but it's very frequent. It's why interviewing them becomes difficult sometimes, because they're used to explaining away their behavior, the abuser's behavior, my black eye, my missing tooth, his screaming and yelling in the background while I'm talking to mom on the phone. So they're used to making excuses for it. It's part of the coping strategy, trying to explain away this behavior. He's had a bad day. She's, really upset about something else that's going on. She's really never like this at any other time. So defending that person is oftentimes a part of the battered spouse syndrome, and getting the person who's been abused to get them to stop defending them so they can talk about the actual abuse becomes a challenge.
Now, the DSM makes reference on occasion to rule-outs, I assume for the diagnosis that's being applied. What is a rule-out?
A rule-out in our parlance says that we should consider these things before we look at other diagnoses. So, for instance, if we're going to consider schizophrenia, we should rule out substance abuse first, because oftentimes some drugs can create hallucinations and delusions and psychotic symptoms. So there's always rule out, just like there are for medical conditions. So look for this before you consider this, is really what a rule out is.
Are there specific rule outs for battered women syndrome or PTSD?
Sure, so there's rule outs for everything, because you're considering a number of different conditions before you make a differential diagnosis, or you pick that's the one that I think best fits this person. So yes, there's rule outs for both of those.
For my sake, what is a differential diagnosis?
That's how you decide which one. It's whether it's your medical doctor, your psychologist, whoever. It's how they pick the right diagnosis. So you're going through kind of a card catalog in your head, and you're saying, all right, there's symptoms of this, but that's also consistent with symptoms of that. So is it schizophrenia? Is it bipolar disorder? Now I have to ask more questions. It's a decision tree. And that decision tree helps you to inform the person and either make a diagnosis in a legal setting or help to treat them clinically.
Now, if the individual, the psychologist who's doing the evaluation, identifies the presence of certain rule-outs, what is their response professionally to those rule-outs in establishing or assessing the patient?
You have to go down a decision tree. And we all kind of do decision trees in our mind every day about what we should do or shouldn't do in certain situations. It happens automatically. It's more structured when you're doing it professionally. So if you have a concern about substances, then you would kind of take that track and you'd have to ask a lot of questions in that area. So you'd want to know what kind of substances, how often are they using those substances, what kind of effect have those substances had on them before. I just picked one of many possible rule-outs there. But every one of them you'd have to explore or ask additional questions because, of course, you don't want to come up with a wrong diagnosis, because in a legal setting, that leads you to a bad opinion. In a clinical setting, it leads to bad treatment.
Now, I want to go back just a second. We talked about the subjective nature of the abused individual's understanding of what's happening. Does this subjective, or does the experience that they have suffered result in, on occasion, their experiencing or their anticipating or assuming or imagining a threat that others may not?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Objection is sustained.
Doctor, from what you've described this morning, I think we're talking about a complex and sophisticated process for assessing and diagnosing PTSD, battered women, the matters that you've described. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
And in this instance, this particular matter regarding the state versus Sarah Boone, were you approached about the possibility of doing an assessment as to Sarah Boone?
Approach.
Doctor, when you are retained to do an evaluation in these matters, what is your practice in regards to the assessment proceedings, the assessment efforts?
Well, I'd first want to know what type of an assessment that it is, because there's different methods of approach that you'd use to analyze and be able to give an opinion on whatever question's being asked of you. So the very first goal for me as a forensic psychologist is to isolate what the question is. So what are they asking me to do? Because I want to know, A, can I do that? Am I qualified to do that, or should I refer that to somebody else? Or B, is that something I'm going to have enough time to do and enough resources to do? Then the next thing I would do is start asking questions about specifically what you already have or what can you get to help me answer this question. So right away I'd start to find out what's available. As forensic psychologists, we're supposed to do comprehensive evaluations of whatever the legal issue or question is, and it's supposed to rely on multiple sources of information. So depending again upon the question, I'm trying to then define early on what are those multiple pieces of information I'm going to need to help to try to give an opinion and an educated opinion about that matter.
Have you done an assessment in this particular case?
No, sir.
Can you tell us very briefly whether that was your decision?
Objection, relevance.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Move on.
Objection sustained.
In your experience, Doctor,
thank you very much.
Can battered women syndrome rear its ugly head? For instance, when there are threats to other members of the family, two-legged or four?
So yes, it's very common that it's not just the person. It increases the terror from someone who's doing the abuse to mention other family members that they might also suffer abuse. So whether it's emotional or physical, those type of things are very common. Not always, but it's very common in the course of domestic violence cases or intimate partner violence cases.
And that fear that's developed by the abused individual may exist contemporaneously with other issues, alcoholism, schizophrenia, and the like. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. They can all be combined together, and certainly that increases if there's other family members that are threatened or live in the same home or close by. That can increase the terror, and the purpose of that is to increase control, to make sure the abuser has more control over the person who's being abused.
1 second, Your Honor. May I?
Yes, sir.
So- In doing an assessment, doctor, do you look at outside materials?
Yes, sir, always.
And what kind of outside materials do you necessarily review in order to make this assessment?
Specifically to battered woman syndrome?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So specific to this, you'd want to look at a lot of different sources of information because you're trying to, A, make a diagnosis if there's a trauma-related disorder, but you're also trying to figure out if there's the other elements necessary to make the diagnosis as well, like abuse that's been chronic over a period of time, and that the person feels they can't leave that situation, and if other people have been threatened. So you'd want to know things like not only what the facts are of the particular incident, usually some crime that's been committed, but you'd want to know the history of those behaviors. Has anyone else seen those? Are there people you can talk to? You know, friends, neighbors, bosses, anybody who's seen or heard of this abuse before? Have there been medical visits where the person has actually been damaged and shown up, made some other excuse, they slipped or fell or whatever it might be? You'd want to do psychological testing as a forensic psychologist because we have very good tests that help us to determine whether someone's suffering from a trauma-based disorder or not. You'd want to know if the person who'd been accused of the crime for this type of evaluation made any statements to the police. If they did, you'd want to hear that statement. Or has there been a 911 call or calls? If that's happened, you'd want to hear that too. So any evidence you could collect, and these are some of those questions I was talking to you about before, you'd want to ask the person who's trying to hire you in the beginning, well, tell me what you have, because you'd want to see whether or not you're going to be able to make this analysis or not. So it's not good enough just to talk to the person, because that's just one form of information. It's almost like being a behavioral detective, if you will, as a forensic psychologist, because we're trying to get as much evidence wrapping around our interview with the person as possible to be able to guide our questions, but inform us and see whether there's what we call convergent validity. It's a fancy way of saying, does everything agree with each other? Does everything connect in a way that it all sort of makes sense? Or are these strange conflicting pieces of evidence that we need to explain away, or it just doesn't fit the criteria? So it's a rather comprehensive and complex evaluation has to be conducted to come up with this. And the final piece I'd say about it is that because oftentimes the abused person is defending still the person that they've oftentimes committed a crime against, it takes a bit of time to get to where you need to go. With all victims of trauma, whether you're talking about situations where you're doing therapy or you're doing an analysis in this type of setting, a criminal setting, it usually takes some time to break through that and get them to trust you to talk about the trauma, but to stop defending the person and talk about the abuse and how they felt about the abuse. Your goal, if you will, is to be able to see what's happening in that situation through the abused person's eyes. If you look at it through your eyes, often it doesn't seem to make sense. But if you look at it through their eyes, if it meets the criteria for a battered spouse, then you can better understand their world and what they're dealing with.
And real briefly, some of the things that you are evaluating when you examine, particularly the individual themselves, you're looking for anxiety and or fear?
Yes.
Low self-esteem?
Yes.
Are you looking for depression?
Yes.
Are you looking for any form of social or interpersonal withdrawal?
Withdrawal, especially if it's forced withdrawal, controlled withdrawal, if there's consequences to socializing with my family, my friends, calling them on the phone, texting them. So especially in that context.
Stockholm Syndrome.
Sure, that can be part of it.
And what is Stockholm Syndrome, real briefly?
So it's really adapting to someone who's captive or taking over a person, controlling their life, sort of adapting to that situation. The famous model of that would be many, many decades ago, a woman called Patty Hearst, who was kidnapped. But it's taking on the beliefs and taking on an acceptance, if you will, of a kind of a captive situation. And in these situations with women who have been abused, who meet the criteria for battered spouse syndrome, they oftentimes adapt, defend, and take on in an acquiescent way that this is okay and I'm part of this situation as opposed to opposed to the situation.
Will this syndrome exhibit itself in physical attributes?
It can, at times, even physical illness at times.
Inability to sleep, inability to keep food down, and those type of things.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Would that individual potentially experience hypervigilance?
Well, that's a large part of it. Of any trauma-based disorder is hypervigilance. What changes when you've been traumatized, any kind of trauma, not just abuse, but what changes is your perception of danger. So whether it's the lid of the garbage can hitting you on your nose, or whether it's someone being abusive towards you, those situations change your perception of danger. So you no longer see that object or that person in the same way. You have a foreboding sense of danger could occur. So other people may not perceive it with that person. He's so nice at work, or he's nice in these other settings, or he's so great on the softball field, but at home he's different. So that person who's being abused, their perception changes.
Does that include denial?
It could include denial, and oftentimes that's part of the explanation. The defensiveness of that person is the denial of how bad things are that are going on.
Thank you, Doctor. For this time.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, sir. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Nice to see you in person.
Good to see you again.
So there's a subjective component to trauma, is what I understand you're saying, correct?
Always. Yes, sir.
And so hypothetically, a couple could be in a 3.5-year relationship with physical violence, emotional violence, even sexual violence, but either or both of those partners may or may not believe that is a traumatic experience for him or herself, correct?
Yes, sir. People mistake the stimulus about what happens as the trauma. The trauma is really the reaction to it. So bad things that happen, people don't always react in the same way to them. So yes, sir, that's correct.
So for instance, a homicide detective or a homicide prosecutor may go out to a scene and see a freshly dead body, and their perception of that environmental stimulus may be very different from somebody who works at Dunkin' Donuts and just gives us muffins in the morning coming across a dead body. Is that fair?
Yes, sir. That homicide detective may be able to go eat lunch right after it, and the other person who works at the donut restaurant may not be able to eat for a couple of days as a result. So yes, perception is a big part of how trauma occurs.
And I understand your answers today, and I'm not saying that they were different the other day. But I understand you to say that it's very important to do a comprehensive evaluation to get the full picture of what is going on in the perceived battered spouse's mind, correct?
When we approach.
Yes.
More continuing coverage in the suitcase murder. The Trial of Sarah Boone is on the way. From the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Press subscribe now.